Love them or hate them, you have to admit that hand traps are a huge portion of what makes modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Modern Yu-Gi-Oh! What I mean by that is that if you look back to way when the game first started, you don't have a lot of hand traps. You have Karibo and you have regular trap cards. Eventually we got cards like DD Crow and Effect Filler. I guess does Gores count as a hand trap? Maybe in old school Yu-Gi-Oh! Does. But as far as modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Goes, when you look at deck lists, oftentimes, unless it's like a pure combo deck, you'll see many different hand traps. Ash Blossom is probably one of the biggest ones, and that makes sense, right? It's good against almost any deck you're expected to play against. Not only good against meta strategies, but also rogue decks too, because every deck is going to search or draw at some point. It's just how Yu-Gi-Oh! Works in 2019. Past that, you see cards like Infinite Impermanence, Effect Failure, Fantastical Dragon Phantasme. These are all very popular hand traps. Maybe you even have some more specific hand traps for certain formats, things like Artifact Lancia, Ghost Reaper, and Winter Cherries. But even with all those hand traps that are topping all the time and come in and out of certain formats, I think there are some hand traps, especially the one that we're going to talk about in today's video, that people are just kind of sleeping on. They're not really talking about, despite them being very good counters to the current meta. The card we're going to talk about in today's video that I feel is very, very undervalued is Ghost Belle in Haunted Mansion. Now this is one of the Ghost sister cards. There are currently 4 of them. There's a new one coming out next week in Dual Devastator, but I really feel compared to the other Ghost sister cards, this one is super undervalued. I mean, people have been talking about Ash Blossom and Ghost Ogre for a long time. Those cards they've had so many reprints and they're still very, very expensive. And then something like Ghost Reaper, which is super specific, only good against very particular matchups that require one extra deck monster to function, even something like that is talked about way more than Ghost Belle in Haunted Mansion. This card right now, the original print, the secret rare printing, is only $10, and that just kind of blows my mind. It has received 1 reprint already. It's getting another reprint in Dual Devastator next week, but I just feel like this card is so much stronger than people are giving it credit for, and I want to talk about how you can use this card against the expected metagame in today's video. Of course, if you'd like to purchase any of the cards that I'm going to talk about, not necessarily just Ghost Belle, but any of the cards that are going to be mentioned in today's video, make sure to use my link to tcplayer.com. It'll be in the description below. If you remember, a portion of those sales go right back into the channel, and because I don't have something like a Patreon, if you want to support me by doing what you'd already be doing, buying Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards, make sure to use that link. It really does help me out a lot. So what does Ghost Belle in Haunted Mansion do? Well, this is an Earth monster. It's level 3. It has 0 attack and 1800 defense. It's a zombie tuner monster. Very similar stats to many of the other Ghost sisters out there. And this one deals with effects that touch the graveyard in some way, shape, or form. So this thing says when a card or effect is activated that includes any of these effects, as a quick effect, you can discard this card to negate the activation. And really keep in mind here that negating the activation is really, really big in this case. I'll talk about that in a couple matchups later on. So this thing says what you can negate is any effect that says any of the following things. If it adds a card or cards from the graveyard to the hand, deck, or extra deck, you can negate that. Or if it special summons a monster card or cards from the graveyard, or if it banishes a card or cards in the graveyard. Then obviously it's a hard one for turn like many of the other Ghost sisters. A lot of people will summarize this effect after looking at it for the first time as an Ash Blossom but for graveyard effects, and that is kind of accurate, but there are a few key differences. The biggest difference is that while Ash Blossom negates the effect of the card, this negates the activation. And why does that matter? Well, one of the spots that it comes up a lot, and I really do mean a lot if you play against any Thunder Dragon player, is that if your opponent uses Thunder Dragon Hawk, then this thing actually will negate the activation, which means that they have to use another Thunder effect in hand to actually summon the Colossus. Where this comes up is if your opponent opens like the God combo, which is Batteryman Solar plus Hawk, this will negate the Hawk's activation to revive a monster card, which means that your opponent can't even turn the Solar into a Colossus unless they have another Thunder effect. And a lot of the times they don't actually have that. Sure, they might, but in a lot of cases they won't, and that means you stopped your opponent's entire combo just with one hand trap. That's really cool too, because one of the things that I like about Ghost Belle in Haunted Mansion, and just cards like this in general, like DD Crow and like Skullmeister, is that some of the things that can happen when you play too many hand traps that do these same things, like Effect Failure and Impermanence, and even Ghost Ogre for a little bit there, is that they all work against the same thing, which means if you open multiple copies of them, like 2 Impermanence and Valor in your opening hand, while that is cool if your opponent has a lot of on-field monster effects, if they do anything in the hand or the graveyard, you have no way of stopping that. That's why Ash Blossom is so good, is because it can affect so many different types of abilities, but things like Effect Failure and Infinite Permanence are way more linear in what they're capable of. But something like Ghost Belle lets you diversify your options, and it's really good against a lot of expected matchups. So for example, just besides the Thunder Dragon thing that I talked about, let's talk about Orcust. Orcust. A lot of people want to know about that because that's obviously like the biggest deck right now. It's the most popular deck by far, the most powerful deck maybe in some cases. A lot of people are playing Orcust as a pure deck or just the Orcust engine in whatever deck they happen to be playing. And Ghost Belle and Haunted Mansion is really, really good against that matchup, all because you can negate that symbol skeleton, that very crucial piece of that Orcust combo. The standard board that they're trying to make is going to be ending on Long Gearsu, Ding Gearsu, and a set Crescendo, or perhaps the Field Spell. But in general, they're not going to use the first Galatea they summon because that leads us to Ghost Ogre, a more popular choice than Ghost Belle. So you can just wait for your opponent, they summon the Long Gearsu, you know what they're going to do, they banish the symbol skeleton, targeting Galatea. What they're trying to do is bring back the Galatea and then use its ability to set a Crescendo and then make the Ding Gearsu over the Galatea, so they end with Long Gearsu, Ding Gearsu, and Crescendo. But if you use Ghost Belle, it stops that completely because now they're forced to make a decision. Do they put the Ding Gearsu over the Long Gearsu? Probably, right? That's going to be standard, but now they have no interruption, right? Even if they hard drew the Crescendo at that point, they don't have a link monster anymore, so I suppose if they hard drew Crescendo, they could just not make Ding Gearsu, but now they don't really have a fantastic way to recycle their cards. Long Gearsu certainly can shuffle back things, but in general, now you've cut yourself off from your main combo, and that's a big deal. So when you use Ghost Belle and Haunted Mansion on that opening Orcust board, you're cutting off multiple interruptions. You're cutting off the Crescendo at the very least, but sometimes you're even cutting off the Long Gearsu from interrupting your plays because your opponent probably is going to use the Long Gearsu and then use the Ding Gearsu to reattach the skeleton. It's just probably what's going to happen, but now they have no interruptions and you can just deal with their board with your own cards. That is really, really strong against one of the best expected combos that you'd face in a Yu-Gi-Oh tournament, and it's one of the reasons that I like this card so much. It's actually the initial thing that drew me to it in the first place. But this card does so much more. One of the more generic uses for this card is to stop opposing Call by the Graves, even going second. I mean, just picture this, like your opponent summons a mermaid, they discard a card, you use Ash, they use Called By. In most cases, you would have to just pass there. I mean, your opponent is going to full combo unless you draw another hand trap, but what if you draw a Ghost Belle instead? Now you can Ghost Belle the Call by the Grave, which is really, really solid because now you got the Call by the Grave out of their hand. I mean, it didn't really work, and then also your Ash Blossom goes through, stopping their initial combo. That's what you're trying to do against Orcust, just stop them from making a board in the first place, and this is one of the cards that can do that in more ways than one. Not just if they actually make the combo go through, but even if they try to stop your other hand trap, you can use this against it, which is really, really strong. But what about other matchups? Because you don't want to play a card that's only good against one matchup. You want to play something that's good against multiple matchups, especially if they're the expected ones. So against Skystrikers, you can use it against Kagari. That's super strong. They only have the one Kagari, and you can use this to stop it, which is really, really good. But even past that, you can use it against Shark Cannon, because one of the really cool parts about Ghost Belle, it doesn't just stop cards that move cards out of your opponent's graveyard, it stops cards that would move cards out of yours as well. That's why it works against Call by the Grave. So Shark Cannon, completely valid card to negate with Ghost Belle. One of the best cards in the Skystriker deck that they're trying to sort of steal all of your cards with the Widow Anchors and the Shark Cannons and just OTK you. This is one of the cards that can prevent that from happening, and so it's really, really strong in that matchup as well. Against Salamangreats, you have so many cards. I mean, really, really so many cards. You have Foxy, you have Spinny, you have even like the Sunlight Wolf itself, adding back a card, you can Ghost Belle that. There are so many different effects in the Salamangreat deck that have graveyard abilities, and this stops most of them. It's really, really solid in that matchup as well. It's not really like as straightforward as, oh, just negate the Kagari, because in the Salamangreat matchup, you have lots of cards they can activate, but you just kind of have to take it on a case-by-case basis. Look at the other cards in your hand. What do you not want them to have? Do you not want them to summon Jack Jaguar? Use this against that. Do you not want them to summon Foxy? Use this against that. It kind of just goes whatever your hand looks like and whatever the board state is at the time. Against Thunder Dragon decks, I mean, we already talked about Hawk, but even past that, you can use it against like Guard Dragon Pisty as a card. You can use it against Chaos Dragon Levianeer if it's trying to revive a monster from your graveyard. All sorts of different situations where Ghost Belle is really good against the expected meta, but even past that, you can use it pretty generically. Not quite as generically as Ash Blossom, but it's pretty decent in most random matchups. I mean, against Altergeist, if they don't have a protocol up, you could negate the Marionetter effect. You special summon a monster from grave. Probably not super likely to happen because they'll probably have a protocol if they have a Marionetter, but maybe like they summon Mulseek turn 1 and then turn 2 they summon Marionetter, so that's the first time they set the protocol. Now you can use the Ghost Belle on the Marionetter to prevent them from bringing back that Mulseek in the grave. Really strong opening play that they could have that you can just stop by drawing Ghost Belle. Really, really solid. Against most matchups, they're going to have some revival effects. Not as consistently. I mean, this card isn't going to work as often as Ash Blossom, that's why it's not as ubiquitous, but it still is pretty valuable against almost any matchup you face because they're almost all going to have some form of recycling. The sheer amount of cards that this thing stops is just astronomical, and I really feel like people should play it more often than it's getting played right now. Like I said earlier, I think with hand traps, it's very important to diversify your options. Having a hand that's like Impermanence and Ghost Belle and Ash Blossom gives you a lot of different ways to deal with a lot of your opponent's opening combos. This is a card that does stuff that other hand traps that are being played right now don't really do, and it's one of the cards that I think people are really just not considering when they're building their decks, but I feel like it's really strong. Certainly we've seen it in Skyshaker decks already, especially the ones that are playing a lot of different hand traps for the reasons that I've talked about in today's video. They want a card that's good against all these different situations, and if you can stop that opponent from using Skeleton, it is so huge. Like, I can't stress that enough. Stopping your opponent from setting that crescendo just means that that deck, that Orcust strategy, doesn't end on like any form of interruption, and you can just OTK them or set up your own board. As you guys can probably tell, I like this card a lot. I think it's very effective against many of the expected matchups that I've kind of talked about in today's video, and like I mentioned at the beginning, if you guys would like to purchase this card or any of the other cards that I talked about, or maybe just any card in general, make sure to use that link in the description below. That helps me out a ton. Anyway though, I'll see you guys later. Let me know what you guys think about Ghost Belle and Haunted Mansion. Is it being slept on, or am I overhyping it? Who really knows? I think the card is successful enough at this point where we can say I'm not overhyping it, because people are playing this card. It's just not as common as things like Ash Blossom and Impermanence, when I feel it's a really big contender against those other hand traps. I'll see you later though. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.